Alright, hello everyone. What I'm going to do in this video is maybe you're currently skeptical about AI, or you have awareness that you should use it but you don't know quite what it can do for you, or you're already on your AI journey but you're feeling a bit lost and a bit confused. And so what I'm going to do in this video is lay out the mental models that I have found most useful in learning about AI myself, and also show you kind of the way I would go about starting off using the chat and the path I would take to go and get to the point where I'm using a tool like Claude Code really to maximize the potential you can get out of AI for your work. So, why should you listen to me? Well, I will be totally honest with you. I am not technical in my background, and quite frankly, for the first couple of years that ChatGPT was around and AI was sort of mainstream, I barely used it. I was also skeptical at one point about it, thought it was just giving me low quality output. But then over the past sort of 9 months, I decided that it would be by far the most valuable thing I could do to teach myself AI as a skill. And as I learned more and more about it and used it more and more, I found my outputs were getting better and it was becoming transformative and almost addictive. And so now I basically do all my work and basically run my entire life through Claude Code. And I also teach other people how they can set up Claude Code and learn about AI and run their work and business through Claude Code or AI in general. And so that brings me to kind of the way I would look at learning AI if I were to go about it today. And fundamentally, I think it's good to view it as sort of a ladder, or I know I've said ladder, but let's actually view it sort of as a staircase. At the bottom step here, this is going to be like your chat, kind of just chatting with Claude or ChatGPT on the web. That might be where you are now, or maybe you're even starting here. Maybe you don't use AI at all. That's fine. We're going to help you get to the top of this staircase. So, your next level up, that's going to be your projects. What I've seen when I've been teaching people is that going from just using chat to using projects can really give them sort of the highest jump in the quality of their outputs with the lowest effort. It's really sort of the highest ROI thing I've seen for people learning how to use AI properly. And we'll get into projects in more detail later. But fundamentally, it allows you really to organize your context. And we'll cover that again in more detail in a second. And then that brings me to what I view as sort of the current top of the staircase for many people, which is going to be something like Claude Code or maybe Codex. It's going to be some sort of like coding agent or where you can manage agents. And essentially with Claude Code, what you can do is basically have a team of AI employees that can do anything a person with a computer could do, more or less, without you having to attend to them constantly. And that's when AI really starts to feel transformative, especially for your work and business. And so that brings us to what I think are the mental models that have helped me most and been the most useful in my AI learning journey, and which I would encourage you to take away. And so, even though these might seem quite simple, I think that they apply across tools, whether you're using the chat or all the way up at Claude Code or beyond. These are kind of the fundamental things that I think is super important to understand when you're trying to improve the quality of AI output. Because that's often a criticism I hear, is that, oh, AI output is rubbish. I've got to disagree with that. I think the models are super intelligent, but it's all about creating the right environment for them to thrive and give you the correct output. And so, if you take almost nothing else away from this video, just please remember context is king. Context is super important. Context sort of has a couple of meanings when we're discussing AI. There's context in terms of the data and information that your model or your AI has access to. And then there's context in terms of context window. And we will discuss both of those in a second. Starting with context in terms of the data and information, really, the way I think about it is context forms the foundations of your output from AI. So really what you want is very strong foundations so that anything you build on top of this is going to be nice and sturdy and high quality in terms of its output. So if we just viewed this, the side-on view of building the context foundations, now let's take a top-down view of it. And this is how I would think about it. I would have your outermost layer is what I would call your master context, which is going to be sort of universally applicable information about you, who you are, how you work with AI, maybe what your business does, that sort of thing. And this will take a few forms, which we'll cover in a moment, but in the first instance, this might be as a markdown file, which you will build and upload into projects, or you might upload a slimmed down version into the chat. But ultimately, what we'd aim to create is some sort of like modular filing system that might have business, and then maybe it would have fitness, basically different markdown files about the relevant context for all areas of your life, or all areas in which you're going to be using AI. And then you would ultimately direct Claude Code, for example, at the correct file for the correct task. That sort of would be the end state. But in the first instance, just understand master context as the outermost layer that is more or less always relevant to everything. Then within that, the next layer is projects. And so what this is going to be is another level of specificity that is relevant to a kind of a specific general task or piece of work you're doing. So maybe you'd have a project about a specific marketing campaign for your business, or maybe if you want to use Claude as a personal trainer, you'd have another project about your fitness and exercise and that sort of thing. And we'll cover projects in a moment in more detail, but essentially projects are going to allow you to put more files into them and relevant instructions. But in the same way that if we take the fitness and the marketing campaign example, you don't really want your workout routine bleeding into your business's marketing campaign. So that's why you would have separate circles for different projects. But ultimately, maybe your business isn't relevant to your exercise, but you in general, the information about you, how you work with AI, is relevant to both projects. And projects are sort of a precursor to what become the files in which you work with Claude Code. But that's the second layer. And then if we take the third layer, which is sort of the highest degree of specificity, that is sort of your prompt specific context. And that's going to be the specific context that you're actually putting in the prompt you're sending at that moment that is going to be most relevant to the task you want to execute with that prompt. If we take that same marketing campaign example, say there are multiple products within that campaign, all of that information about the business, the products, the ICP would live in the project level, but then in the prompt specifically, you would specify the context of which products you want to mention in that specific advertising or something like that. That's how I conceptualize it, getting more and more specific as you go. And then back to the other version of context I mentioned, which is the context window, which is, if you think about every chat or discussion you have with AI kind of as a box, as you go back and forth more, this box eventually starts to fill up. And this box is a fixed size, which is usually measured in tokens. Don't have to worry about that too much now, but a token is sort of like the currency of AI, or the way of measuring how much input and output AI is using. And a token is sort of like a chunk of a word. And normally you'll have either 200,000 or 1 million tokens for this context window, depending on the model you're using. But the issue is that as you go back and forth more, this context window fills up with more and more tokens, and as you have fewer and fewer tokens remaining, the quality of the output actually starts to decrease, and that is something called context rot. And so what you want to do is try to avoid this, and that means where possible you should start new conversations or new context windows for different tasks. And the other reason you want to do that is that every time AI gives you new output, it actually rereads all of the previous stuff. And so if there's something irrelevant and you try to switch to a new task down here, it might get distracted by the earlier mention of that previous task. But of course, there can be issues with that initially, because in the first instance, if you start a new chat and it has no memory or no idea of what's gone previously, then you're going to have to re-explain yourself entirely. And that is why we have things like projects and ultimately kind of filing systems and context systems so that you're not having to re-explain yourself every time. And we'll touch on that more in a moment. But first, the other key mental model is sort of, I like to think of it as the building blocks of good communication with AI. In the past, I probably would have presented this as sort of the building blocks of a good prompt, but I would now suggest that not all of these have to be contained within the actual prompt that you give to AI, but they should be somewhere within sort of the general environment, if you will. So some of them might be in your prompt. If this is your prompt, you might have some of the prompt specific context in there. You might have the task you want it to do in there. You might have other things, but in the environment in general, what you might have is, for example, as we'll cover in a moment, you can have instructions in a project. So that's not necessarily going to be in your prompt, but that will live in the environment. And maybe you'll also have in a project, or Claude Code will have access to examples. And now let me explain what I actually mean by all of these different blocks. So the role, you might have heard some in the past tips like you should prompt saying you are an expert mathematician or something like that. Nowadays, I would say you don't need to put that in the prompt. The models are quite good at inferring sort of what persona they should embody from the actual task they've been given. However, if you want a really specific angle or take on something, you might want to mention it. So if you're trying to, let's say, again, plan a marketing campaign, if you want the specific angle of, like, you are a university student, how would you view this marketing campaign? Would you be compelled to buy the product? That's when I think mentioning the role in the actual prompt can still be useful. But the reason I bracketed it out is because I don't think it needs to be included in the prompt most of the time. Now, that brings us to the actual stuff you should put in the prompt, which I would say is context, definitely, and task. These are sort of the two most important. And then format and constraints are really a subset of task, I would argue. So again, going back to the first mental model we had, context is key. And this here would be that innermost circle. So this one of the context, as we just discussed. So it's stuff that is hyper-specific to the exact task you want your AI to execute right now, whereas the more general context that is needed sort of lives in the surrounding environment. Then task is kind of self-explanatory. It's essentially the task you want the AI to do. So maybe it is, if we run with that marketing campaign example, produce the timeline for creating the different pieces of the marketing campaign, something along those lines. Maybe it's plan a YouTube video promoting this new product as part of the marketing campaign. And then format is sort of a subset of task, saying how you want it to be output. So maybe that's something like a full YouTube video script for that example we just gave, or maybe it's an HTML artifact of the timeline that is interactive and clickable, or maybe it's a markdown file. You get the idea. And then constraints sort of goes hand in hand with format, which is things to avoid essentially. So maybe you're going to tell it to avoid AI tells in writing, like M dashes, or using too many rules of three or something like that. So that's how constraints can be constraints in terms of the output. You could also have constraints in terms of the input. So maybe it's only look at resources from within the past 6 months, or it's only look at previous D2C marketing campaigns. That brings us on to the final element of good communication, which again I've bracketed because it's optional in terms of putting it in the actual prompt, but I would recommend having it in the environment, especially once you've got kind of projects or Claude Code set up. What that would be is examples of the output you want. So maybe it's examples of your voice when writing. If you want AI to output a piece of writing that's going to sound much more like you, that can be far more useful than actually a list of rules. Or maybe, running again with this marketing campaign example we've developed, maybe it's your previous marketing campaigns, so that it can see kind of how your company does marketing, the style you use in terms of creating visuals, that sort of thing. So anytime you have evidence of the sort of output you'd like to get, those examples can be even more useful than just writing what the format should be and what the constraints should be. But they would probably live in the environment rather than in the specific prompt itself. And so those are kind of the mental models, I would say, that apply, I think, across all levels of AI that I found the most useful, both in my own learning and teaching. Which then leads me on to some more practical tips. So one of the main ones I would say is it's much faster to speak to your AI using some form of dictation tool. The one I use is called Whisperflow. I'm not affiliated with them, but I use it all the time, and it's really good in my opinion. There's another one called Glido, which I haven't used, but I hear good things about it. And the reason I recommend that you use dictation tools is essentially you can speak much faster than you can type for most people, I would argue. And linking back to that first mental model that context is king, the more context you can get in faster, the higher quality output you're going to have. And so if you can speak and give more context, more detail, more specificity, that is going to give you high quality output. The next practical tip I would recommend, again, links to those mental models and the idea that context is king. And this is sort of what I mentioned as that outermost circle of context, which is your master context. And now, as I said, there's a few ways to go around this. I would say the most rudimentary, basic way in the first instance is to set up like a master context markdown file. So that would be a file that has some information about you, who you are, how you work with AI, how AI should work with you, what you do for business, stuff about live context, stuff that is basically relevant to almost all the work you're going to do with AI. And then you can take this and put it into the various projects you have. And so you have this saved on your computer and you can just always upload it. And then you're going to get much more relevant and kind of personalized responses in your projects and in the work you do with AI. I would also recommend in the first instance that you create a kind of shortened version of this, like a core master context that you can upload maybe just into a chat if you're not working in the project without flooding the context window and causing context rot. And then maybe also create some kind of, as we were mentioning earlier, sort of modular versions of this with more specificity. And again, save them as files on your computer and you can upload them into the relevant projects. And that would be the first instance. What I would then recommend is once you've got it set up in Claude Code, you would have a much more modular filing system where I have sort of like business.md, which is all the context about kind of about my business. And then maybe I have like a fitness.md, and md just means markdown file, which is going to be about fitness. And then what I have is the claude.md within Claude Code, which is kind of its brain, and I will have other videos explaining that in more detail. Is it's going to have sort of an index of this filing system, and that way it can route its queries to the correct context. So that way you're not flooding the context window with all of this at once, because this, these are probably not going to be relevant to each other necessarily. But when I have a business question, what it's going to do, Claude is going to check the index in its brain, and then it's going to point to the correct context file for that one. And what you can then do is set up schedule tasks that are going to update these documents or prompt you to update them automatically, so that you always have a kind of up-to-date context filing system that Claude can navigate. And that is how I would ultimately set it up in Claude Code. But in the first instance, just getting started, you can just have one master context file that you upload to projects. And for all of these, whether it's in Claude Code or whether it's just the master context document, the best way to set it up is through an interactive interview process with the AI. So essentially you're telling it, I want to set up this master context document that will have all the information you need to give me the highest quality outputs which are relevant. Interview me one question at a time, and then save that output as a markdown file. And if you want to get a prompt that can conduct that interview process for you, I have those in my school community, which I'll mention in more detail later. And that then brings us on to what is the second rung of the ladder, which is projects. And what projects are a bit like files on your computer. You wouldn't just save everything randomly to your desktop. You're going to create a kind of filing system so that you can go look at all the relevant information and documents about something at once when you're working on it. And so a project creates a kind of like siloed contextual environment, going back to the idea that we started with, which is context, and managing context is so important. Within a project, what you have is instructions which tell the AI how to interact with you in every chat within that project. Then you have files, which is where you're going to put probably your master context that we just mentioned. It's also where you're going to put any relevant examples or documents about your business, perhaps, if this is a business related project. If we go back to that marketing campaign example we were using earlier, you'd probably put something like your ICP file about what the product is, put your examples of past campaigns or campaigns that you think achieve what you want, or campaigns that you'd like to replicate. And then the final element is, which I haven't left myself space for, is memory. And what this is that every chat, so chat to chat within that project, there is shared awareness of the previous chat. And so what that allows is that, as we mentioned earlier, you want to start new chats for different tasks so that you're not using up your context window for each of them and causing context rot. And so what that allows is that you can start new chats within this project more or less as you wish, and it will still have all the understanding, because it's as if every chat essentially starts with all of this information sort of preloaded into it, so that it's actually relevant and you're not having to explain yourself again every time, as you would if you were just starting a new chat not using projects. And so for many people, I think going from just using the various chats without proper project setup to using projects where you're actually setting up the contextual environment properly is a huge jump. Here's what it looks like to set up a project. So you'd go to the sidebar, click on projects, start a new project. Let's imagine a fictional scenario where we run a marketing agency, and this is for one of our clients. This would be the project for them. So let's say they're called the Wold Collection, and it's a hotel. Now what you want to do is come here. This is your instructions. This is your files to upload instructions. Here's some I've prepared. You can see it gives guidance on how to interact in these sessions. Save those, and then in terms of files, what I'll do is upload some ones that I've prepared, which are kind of a profile about this fictional marketing agency, some examples of their previous work, their previous writings, so that Claude could match the voice, some information about the studio, and some information about the client for this specific project. And then if I just start a new chat, I can say something like, draft this month's update email for the hotel. And Claude, because we're working in a project, should have all the understanding of what I mean when I say the hotel, the information for this month's update, and also the style of writing that this studio uses for their emails. And then we can see that Claude, because it's in the project, has understood kind of who's being referenced when I say the hotel, who the owners are, because that's in the project files. And then this matches the style of the example emails that are in the project files. And then, as per the instructions, it highlights any gaps. Because as we can see in the instructions, it says, when uncertain, flag the gaps. So those are the sorts of things you can add to the instruction to avoid hallucinations. You can always get it to check with you when you're working in that project. And then the final element of projects is that if I were to start new chats, and as I accumulate more chats in here, it builds up memory of the various chats, and they're all stored in one place. The limitation somewhat with projects though, which Claude Code, when we get there, fixes, is that it's still down to us to take this email and copy and paste it and send it. But that's a quick idea of projects, and hopefully you can see how by working in projects you can have much more control and organization of your context, which leads to you getting better and more accurate output. And so then that brings us on to sort of the final rung of that ladder that I mentioned in the beginning, which I think is really where you start to feel like you have superpowers almost with your work using AI, is Claude Code. Because Claude Code can essentially do more or less anything that a person with a computer could do for most cases. So it can use a browser to do tasks, it can connect to your emails, it can connect to your calendar, it can connect to all sorts of tools. Claude Code is amazing. And I'll have many videos in the future going into much more detail about all things Claude Code, like how you set up skills, how you set up MCP servers, how you connect it to tools, how to build your Claude.md. So I won't go into too much detail right now about these, but Claude Code just gives you a whole host of productivity gains, in my opinion, and I absolutely love using Claude Code. And even though it's called Claude Code, you can use it for so much more than just coding. You really use it for almost all knowledge work, in my opinion. The analogy I kind of like to use with Claude Code is thinking of it a bit like an F1 car, like the F1 car of AI in a way. There's a bit more engineering that needs to go into it, a little bit more setup, kind of slightly higher risk in using it because it does have access to your files, and it theoretically could delete something if you weren't careful. But the potential output you can get is so much higher. And so once you start using it and feeling confident, it is an amazing tool and an amazing feeling to be using Claude Code. So now we're in Claude Code, and the difference here is that we're actually working in a folder. So we're working in this folder, which has in it a Claude.md. I'll cover that in more detail in a later video about Claude Code. And what it has is some information about the studio and the client. So a bit like with the projects, we had files loaded into it. Here it has access to these files because we're working in that folder. So here, let's just say we're going to get it to prepare for a meeting, a hypothetical meeting that we're having, and this is the same theoretical example as we did with the projects. And as we can see, it's using a skill. So skills are another thing that are really great about Claude Code, and I'll cover them in more detail in the future as well. But it essentially allows you to have shortcuts to do repeated workflows, and so they are a real time saver and productivity gain. And then what Claude Code has done is it's used that skill and it's followed the workflow that that skill details, and then it's used a sub-agent to go do relevant research, and then what it's done is it's created this HTML document which is the briefing, and then it even checked its work and reread it because I have a hook, and as part of that hook I've set it up so that it checks voice rules against a guide I have to make sure that it's got British spelling and doesn't have any M dashes or anything like that. And this is just a very simple but nice HTML kind of dashboard of the information. And so this took a few minutes, but it didn't require any interactivity from me other than the initial prompt. So you could run many of these in parallel. This is really just scratching the surface of Claude Code. You could even set this up to happen automatically after it scans your calendar. It prepares you for the meetings automatically. Or from here, I could have Claude Code go and send this out. And the thing with Claude Code is that you can set up like design guides that it always reads. So whenever I have it produce an HTML artifact like this, it's more or less going to be in this color scheme with this style because I have a design markdown file that dictates how it should design these. And so that's the nice thing about Claude Code. And so that's really just a very small insight into the sort of stuff you can do with Claude Code, and hopefully you could see how the opportunities are more or less endless with Claude Code as you extend its capabilities and push it further. But this was just a quick demo of one way it could be used in a business use case. And so that was one quick demo of just one thing you can do with Claude Code. But the great thing about Claude Code is that essentially you can be running all sorts of tasks like this in parallel. So you could have one triaging your emails, one looking through your calendar, one doing deep research on people with whom you have meetings tomorrow, all that sort of thing. You could have another one creating the resources for that marketing campaign we were discussing earlier. Really, you can sort of do anything. So it almost minimizes your marginal cost of doing any additional task, because you can just start running many and many in parallel. And ultimately, when you get more advanced with Claude Code and you start using tools like Goal or that sort of thing, what you can do is just give Claude Code a task and clear criteria for success, set it off on that, and it will keep going until it meets its success criteria. So you could be sleeping while it's doing that, you could be in the gym, or you could be doing a client call, you could be doing anything, and it can be working on its own. And so that's why I love Claude Code so much, and I find it so transformative. And I would recommend that most people aim to get to using Claude Code, because it can give you so many productivity gains, and it's just loads of fun. But even in Claude Code, I still think you're going to be using the same fundamental mental models about understanding how important it is to set up the right context environment to which your AI has access, and thinking about those core blocks of communicating with AI, the RCTFCE framework, and still using tools like a more modular filing system version of your master context and dictation tools rather than typing. So that's why I think it's important to get those mental models understood before you jump into using all the tools, and ramp up, starting by using projects which you can start doing today and get higher quality output than just using the chat. And then you eventually become more familiar with how to think about these mental models, which you can then bring into using Claude Code to get even more output and productivity gains for your business or for any other area of your life. And I hope if you were feeling confused about AI, that gave you sort of a more clear way of how to go about getting more productivity and higher quality output of it more clearly, and a roadmap to follow in many ways. If you did find them useful, please do subscribe, because I'm going to be making many more videos on everything I know about Claude Code and AI. There'll be a link to my school community in the description, which has those resources and even more detailed lessons and guides on everything I've learned on my AI and Claude Code journey. And finally, if you'd like to work with me one-on-one for coaching to help you build out your personal AI operating system around Claude Code or Codex, connecting it exactly to the tools you use and converting things like your business's SOPs into skills, and creating your personalized AI operating system, especially if you're a business owner or business executive, feel free to book a call with me using the link in the description to discuss one-to-one coaching. So thanks for watching. I hope that helped. If you have any questions, feel free to drop them in the comments, and subscribe for more AI videos.